Okay, hey everyone. So as Adam has mentioned a couple times, after we arrived at the end of the Gospel of Mark on Easter, the teaching team decided to just sort of take things week by week instead of starting another pre-planned series. The flexibility that allows just seemed right to us in this very weird time. And this week, as Adam mentioned, I've decided to use that flexibility to talk about the book of Job, which is also very weird. So if you haven't read it in a while, the bulk of the action in Job happens in the first three and then like the last 4 or 5 chapters out of a pretty big 42 chapter book. And so I want to start by just going over a little bit of that story in case our memory needs some reminding. So in the beginning, we meet Job, and he lives in the land of Uz, which is sort of being used in the way we would say once upon a time. It's not necessarily being presented as a historical account so much as a fable or a parable, like a far longer version of the ones that Jesus told. So whether this story happened or not, the goal of writing it down and including it in scripture is to make a theological point much more than to recount history. So we meet Job, and Job is a righteous man who worships God, and God has blessed him. He has a lot of money, he has a lot of livestock, and he has a lot of kids, which is Old Testament code for just the full package of a very good life. Then one day, Satan is hanging around God's palace in heaven, and he poses this challenge to God. He says the only reason Job is good is that Job is happy, and he sort of bets God that if Job becomes unhappy, if he loses his good life, he will stop being righteous and he'll curse God to his face. So God gives Satan permission to test Job per this proposal, and Satan does. Specifically, Satan starts by killing Job's kids and his livestock. But still, Job is trying very hard to be faithful for God, even in the midst of his suffering. So his first response to everything that happens is a pretty famous passage that you may know. Naked I came from my mother's womb, he says, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Now this, sounds very holy, but it isn't actually true. It is true, presumably, that Job was born without clothes, right? But God has not taken anything away from Job. And so Job is trying to be righteous here. He's trying to do what God wants, but he's wrong on the facts about what God has done. Of course, he has no idea that he's wrong, and neither, it turns out, do any of the other human characters. So this is all happening, and then Satan goes back to God and gets permission to attack Job further because he hasn't gotten the result that he wanted. He hasn't gotten Job to curse God. And so he gets permission to attack Job with illness. And God says Satan can do this as long as he doesn't kill him. So now Job is covered with boils and he's poor, and the only family he has left is his wife, who is pretty mean to him and blames him for all the bad things that have happened to them. In fact, Job's wife comes up to him. You get the sense that he's sort of living outside of the house, just, like in the dirt. And she comes up to him and mocks him for still trying to worship God correctly when it seems just so obvious to her that God has rejected Job and is punishing him, and still trying to be righteous is pointless. And she says, are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die. And that's, I think, a very sick burn in the ancient Near East. But Job is still hanging in there. And so he answers, you're talking like an immoral woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? And so at this stage, Job is still very much determined to stick it out. He's going to withstand the suffering because he thinks, it's only fair that God gets to do whatever he wants to his creation, and that can include testing or outright cruelty. But Job's attitude it doesn't last as much as he tries. He's sitting around scratching his boils, very gross, and 3 of his friends show up. The first thing they do is just hang out with Job for a week and silently mourn with him, which is not a bad move. But that whole week, Job seems to just be sitting there stewing, and he's finding it harder and harder to hold on to this attitude he's chosen. In fact, he's getting angrier and angrier at God. And so finally, when the 7 days are up, Job begins talking, and he starts by cursing the day he was born. And this is in Job chapter 3 at this point, if you want to read along. He says, why did I not perish at birth and die as I came from the womb? Or why was I not hidden away in the ground like a stillborn child, like an infant who never saw the light of day? Job gets very dark very fast, and he goes on like this about how it'd be better if he'd never been born, and eventually he accuses God of making his life not worth living. Why is life given to a man, he says, whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? For sighing has become my daily food, my groans pour out like water. What I feared has come upon me, what I dreaded has happened to me. I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest, but only turmoil. And so that's when Job's three friends start talking, because they wanted to answer this accusation that Job is leveling against God. Both Job and the friends assume that what he's suffering is something God is doing, even though, of course, we know that's not true. So Job's friends agree with him that God is responsible for what's happening here. But they don't want to concede that God would be unjust by doing bad things to a good person. So if God definitely did it and God wouldn't be unjust, that means that Job isn't a good person. He must have done something wrong to make God angry. And they tell Job if he would just stop sinning, God would make everything good for him again. And Job, of course, has not actually sinned, and so he keeps protesting he didn't do anything wrong and that God is just persecuting him for no good reason. And this goes on for chapters and chapters with very long speeches. And in the middle of all that talking, a fourth friend shows up. And he argues that this whole thing isn't about Job doing wrong or God being unjust. Instead, he says God is testing and teaching Job to make him even more righteous. And the suffering will go away once Job learns the lesson and becomes a better person. And this also goes on for chapters and chapters, and Job stays very angry at God throughout the whole thing. In chapter 6, he says God is torturing him. In chapter 7, he says God is harassing him. In chapter 9, he says God is unfair and won't listen to reason. And he really doesn't let up accusing and challenging and insulting God for the whole book. And then finally at the end, God appears. And he is also very angry, but not really at Job. God rebukes everyone for speaking out of ignorance, Job and the four friends. And this is where he talks about Leviathan, this giant beast that was in the poem Adam read, as a way of showing how ignorant they are, that God has made this incredible creature and they don't know anything about it. But even amid all that, God still praises Job for his honesty. He does not say Job's accusations were correct, and they weren't, just like so much of what Job's friends had said was wrong. But still, he praises his honesty. So the first three friends were wrong when they claimed that Job had sinned and that he was suffering divine punishment. And the fourth friend was wrong, that God was trying to test Job or teach him a lesson. And Job himself was wrong when he accused God of unjustly torturing him, because God was not responsible for the evil Job suffered, and he wasn't using Job's pain for punishment or testing. And so when God shows up, he says, none of them know what they're talking about, but Job at least kept honestly seeking God and demanding to know God better. But the interesting thing is, by the end of God's monologue, all the human characters remain totally ignorant of what really happened. God never tells them what Satan did. He never mentions that Satan was involved at all, really, not in any straightforward way. Instead, God reminds them of who he is. He reassures them of his good character, but he does not fill them in on the reasons for the evil they've encountered. God does offer them some certainty, but it's the certainty of trusting his character, not the certainty of an explanation for what's happening in their lives. And that's sort of difficult sometimes, because what's happening in our lives is, happening in our lives. And God does not show up, speaking from a whirlwind, the book of Job says, God does not show up as a tornado in our yard and give us speeches reminding us what his character is like. And that would be both very cool and very terrifying, but it is not God's current habit. And I don't know, given the choice between certainty about God's eternal character and certainty about my particular situation, I would say I want certainty about God's eternal character, obviously, because that's the right answer. But if I'm honest, certainty about my particular situation would be very appealing, because that is the thing happening uniquely to me in this moment. Now, the tricky thing about the book of Job is that it's a lot like the multiple choice test I had to take in the history class in high school, which I still remember because the teacher outright told us most of the answers are right, but one answer is more right than the other answers. And this was incredibly frustrating. And so in Job, likewise, the stuff everyone says is not 100% wrong. They're wrong in their assumption that God is the one hurting Job, and they're wrong in their explanations for why God is doing this thing he's not doing. But they're not wrong about everything. Sometimes God does discipline people for wrongdoing in this life before his final judgment. We have accounts of that in the Bible, including in the New Testament. And sometimes God does use events in our lives to teach us and test us. Scripture talks about that too. So Job's friends aren't wrong that God can operate that way, but they're wildly ignorant about God's character if they think God would just slaughter a bunch of kids and animals to punish or test someone. So Job's friends are wrong in three ways, even though they don't get everything entirely wrong. First, they're wrong about the facts of what happened to Job. Second, they're wrong about the extent of their own knowledge, which is to say they think they know more than they really do. And then third, worst of all, they're very wrong about what God is like. And that, I think, is why God shows up and talks about his character, not the facts of this situation or whether he does or does not sometimes punish or test people. Because on the scale of these three things, they're getting wrong. Thinking that God is the type of God who kills kids and animals to teach a lesson or to punish a totally separate person is definitely the biggest thing to get wrong. And as much as we want to have certainty about the facts of our circumstances, realistically, we won't always get that. And so if the story of Job was ended with God showing up and saying, hey, Job and friends, you guys are wrong because it was Satan this whole time, what good does that do for us? It doesn't explain the cause of anything we suffer. It would just be a story about evil doing evil, and we already know that happens sometimes. But instead of revealing the facts of what Satan did to Job, God arrives to reveal his character, which, as we celebrated on Easter, he has also done for us, and he has done it far more clearly than talking out of a whirlwind. And I wanted to talk about Job this week because as this pandemic continues, lots of people, including prominent Christian pastors and authors, like our good friend John Piper across the river, are popping up very much like Job's friends to say that this sickness may be God disciplining us or testing us, to say in one way or another that God is the type of God who kills tens of thousands of people with a virus because he wants to teach someone or some group of people a lesson. And if we know anything from knowing Jesus, we should know that that is not true. Like Job, even at the end of his story, we don't know and probably never will know in this life all the reasons, be they physical or spiritual or some mix of the two, for this pandemic happening as it has. And that sucks. I don't know about you, but I would very much like to know those things now. It would be a very big scoop and I would win a Pulitzer. But we can know that God is not like that, and that the God revealed in Christ healed people instead of killing them and died for people who hated and wronged him. The Bible and the Christian life are both concerned with seeing God with increasing clarity. In the Bible, God's people move from getting these brief, confusing visions of God, like a whirlwind or like the burning bush, to the full revelation of God's character in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And in the individual Christian life, hopefully, we're spending our lives coming to better understand and imitate that character. At the end of our lives, the Bible promises over and over, we will see God with face to face. We will see God face to face with complete clarity and no ignorance or confusion. Even Job, when he's so mystified and angry, knows this promise. He says in chapter 19 that he will see God with his own eyes, and he says his heart yearns for that to happen. We're not to that point yet, but we can seek and we should be seeking to move closer to it. Psalm 27 expresses that yearning Job mentions, and I'm going to close by reading a portion of that psalm. One thing I ask of the Lord that I will seek after, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. For he will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will set me high on a rock. Now my head is lifted up above my enemies all around me, and I will offer in his tent sacrifices with shouts of joy. I will sing and make melody to the Lord. Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud. Be gracious to me and answer me. Come, my heart says, seek his face. Your face, Lord, do I seek. Okay, and then like last week, we are getting back into having a Q&A time. So if you have a question, unmute yourself and pipe up. Or yeah, if you don't want to do that, you can type it in the chat and I will read it.
Honey, you may have already answered this, but all I keep thinking or wondering is, like, why did God allow Satan to do all these horrible things to Job? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, so that's a good question. The easiest answer may be if it's only intended as a parable and not something that ever happened, then God does it because that's the setup we need for the story to make this point about God's character at the end. If we want, and there are stories there are parables that Jesus tells where you have to do that take that same sort of view of like it's happening in the story, but it's not completely real. The obvious one is the parable where Jesus likens God to an unjust judge who the woman comes and keeps begging him to give her the judgment that she deserves. And finally, he's just like, fine, leave me alone. I will do it. And Jesus says, God is like that, and that's why you should pray. But of course, God is not really like that in a lot of ways. So that's one answer, that, the parable is like an analogy and you shouldn't push it too far. I think another possible answer, though, if you want to not sort of just work within the story, would be that, it's while here we have this specific instance of Satan going to God and saying, can I do this bad thing? And God allows him to do it. Sort of as the way the world works is God allows free agents to make evil choices. And so it's a little bit different in that Satan asks for permission first, but it's fundamentally not really different from the way the world generally operates. And if anything, God saying, you can't kill him is putting a constraint on Satan's behavior that's not always there.
How do we know that he asked for permission if he never told Job that?
So we, as sort of like the readers, there's an omniscient narrator who tells us what happened in heaven. It's in like the first or second chapter. We have just scenes that take place in heaven where no one could have witnessed it, and Satan strolls up and is like, "Hey, can I do this?" So just for the purpose of the story, we have like this bigger picture view that no human involved ever could have had. Anybody else?
I had a question. So thinking about Job and what's happening now, and kind of reminds me a little bit about like the plagues in Egypt, and kind of how does that relate to the character of God? Because it seems like two different things.
That's a very big question. And as I was preparing, I was like, I wonder if somebody's going to ask this, because there's no way I can answer it satisfactorily in our Q&A time. But like the super brief version that I would say is two things. One, some of the sort of the large scale judgments that God renders in the Old Testament, be they plagues or like allowing an invasion to happen, it's not always illness. Some of that has to do with like if it's Israel being subjected to that consequence, they have this very specific covenant relationship with God where I think there are still questions about God's character to be answered there, but in advance they have like signed up for, if we don't be faithful to you, consequences will happen. And so it's distinct from sort of just like, why is this pandemic happening to us? I don't know, maybe we sinned, where there's that prearranged relationship where if you do this, this will happen. The plagues in Exodus, of course, don't happen to Israel, they happen to the Egyptians, and so there's no relationship like that. The two things I would say about that, one is that, again, there is that announcement, that warning. So it's not as in like a case like this, all of a sudden bad things are happening and you don't know why, and you sort of have to like grope around and figure out like, what can I do to make it stop? because Moses and Aaron go and very explicitly say, like, let these people go or things will happen to you. But the other thing, and the bigger thing that I think is more important to the question of God's character there, is if you go back and read it, it does not actually describe God like killing the firstborn in particular. That I think is the clearest one. It describes something called the destroyer coming in and killing the firstborn children. And God allows that to happen. But the suggestion is that the destroyer always wanted to come kill people probably, and God was restraining that evil beforehand. And so it's less, it's not God actively inflicting these things so much as we live in a fallen world with spiritual and natural and human forces of evil. God restrains a lot of that frequently. Just as in the story of Job, he restrains Satan from killing Job, but he can lift that restraint, and it's not God doing these things. It's God allowing things that wanted to perpetuate evil to do that. So to me, that makes a difference. But yeah, like I said, that only scratches the surface and won't probably answer that question satisfactorily.
That was helpful.
Okay, good. Okay, well, if there aren't any more, then I will, and I don't see any in the chat, then I will turn things over to Adam for prayer.